Hi everyone, my name is Dina Ticas, and I want to share with you my capstone project through the University of San Diego. My research context is a 5th grade multiple subject classroom. I have 34 students. 4 of them are English language learners and 3 students who have an IEP and or a 504 plan. My needs assessment. When this group of students were given a baseline assessment on 4th grade standards, they scored between 70 and 78%. And when I looked at the summary results of their state testing, which is a Smarter Balanced Performance test in the area of problem solving and modeling, 53.8% of my class performed near standard and 11.5% performed below standard. Now, this data was only applicable to 26 of 34 of my students, since 8 students are either new to the district or the state, and so there is no score recorded for them. Across the grade level, we saw similar numbers ranging between 60 and 70% who were performing near or below standard in the area of problem solving and modeling. Within the area of concepts and procedures, 50% of the incoming class scored near or below standard, and in the area of communicate reasoning, 54% scored near or below standard. The overall performance in the area of math indicated that 73% of students met or exceeded grade level standards. I begin the school year with a student survey in which I ask the students to describe how they feel about each content area. So I start by asking my students about how they feel towards math and calculating in math. So the question I ask is, how do you feel about math problems involving numbers, symbols, and calculating answers? And 32% of my class had mixed feelings. Now, this is neither decisively negative or positive feelings. 67% indicated positive feelings, and 0.06% indicated negative feelings. And you can see some of the comments that my students gave me were, I'm okay, but I get a little stuck. I just need a little bit of help. I feel confident about solving math problems. And one student who said, I feel mad and I feel scared. I also asked the question, how do you feel about your ability to solve math word problems or math stories? 38% said they felt decisively negative, and 62% said they felt positive. A couple comments that I had were, I'm nervous because they can be tricky. Another student said, I don't like word problems, so sometimes I feel like I get the answer wrong. While another student said, I feel great. I don't always get them right, but that's part of learning, right? My action research question was, how will the implementation of problem-solving strategies improve students' overall performance on problem-solving tasks? 2 sub-questions were, will the use of a mnemonic device, a poem, help students take apart a word problem in order to solve it successfully? And will the use of a graphic organizer help students organize their thinking in order to solve difficult problems? As a result of my needs assessment, I came to these conclusions. My students need to improve their ability to solve word problems and work out problem-solving tasks. So an intervention should include something that will help guide their thinking. And this intervention must help students feel more confident about their answers. And I will continue to provide explicit instruction. A guiding theory of this research is the theory of constructivism, that states that learners construct their own meaning from information in the environment and that they build on prior knowledge and understanding. Applying a constructivist theory to a classroom context results in the cognitive apprenticeship theory. And it states that the process of thinking is often invisible to both the student and the teacher. And so it seeks to make thinking visible. It utilizes instructional practices like modeling, coaching, scaffolding, articulation, reflection, and exploration in order to provide students with access to the thinking that experts employ while they are problem solving. One of the unique characteristics of cognitive apprenticeship is the metacognitive skills that develop as the master instructs the apprentice. In looking at the research, the terms explicit and direct instruction were used synonymously in many research articles. Direct instruction is often seen as scripted and sequential, whereas explicit instruction provides more teacher models and feedback during instruction. For the purposes of this research, I will define explicit instruction as teaching in a structured manner that includes step-by-step procedures and typically follows the instructional sequence of modeling, guided practice, independent practice. Researchers Kingsdorf and Kroik conducted an intervention in which explicit instruction was one of 3 of the elements that were being implemented, and what they found was that the explicit instruction format resulted in very favorable student outcomes. Another article that I reviewed during my literature review dealt with schema-based graphic representations. Jitendra, who is a researcher in the article, developed a intervention in which she applied graphic organizers and diagrams in order to help students who were considered learning disabled within the context of a general education classroom. So her approach used schemata identification and problem representation, and she used explicit modeling in order for students to identify some of the features within the problems that they were given. Things like change, groupings, and comparing problems. And she had students draw diagrams in order to depict their problem that they were given, but also to describe their understanding, and also provided them with a note-taking sheet so that they could determine what operation they needed to use. And the conclusion that they came to was that there was a dramatic improvement in students' problem-solving scores, and not only did they improve, but they maintained the skill for a period of 4 weeks. So Zinn, Jitendra, and Dietland Buckman also conducted a similar investigation in which they used 2 different approaches. And one was a schema-based, where they identify the type of problem and then draw a diagram, and then the other was a general strategy in which they just draw any diagram or picture, to represent the problem. And what they found was that a schema-based instructional approach helps students develop their conceptual knowledge and led to the use of higher order thinking skills. A final article that I reviewed was the error analysis applied to Mayer's model by Kingsdorf and Kroik. This study compared the types of errors that students who were considered AA average achieving and students who were LD, students with learning disabilities, and the types of errors that they made when they were attempting problem-solving tasks. So they applied Mayer's 4-step model, which included the steps of translation, integration, planning, and execution. Within the translation step, students were to identify the facts that they were given and identify what numbers they were going to need and which were unnecessary. In the integration step, students were to apply their schematic knowledge to determine which operation they would need to apply. In the planning stage, they used their strategic knowledge in order to identify the steps or the order of steps that they needed to employ in order to work out the problem. And then finally, in the execution step, they used their understanding of algorithmic knowledge in order to compute and determine their final answer. And what they found was that there was a deficiency in self-monitoring and motivation. So one conclusion was that while the students were able to identify important pieces of information within word problems, they had difficulty in knowing where to apply the steps. So one conclusion that we can come to is that this bolsters a need for scaffolding during the problem-solving process, so that Mayer's model, coupled together with a graphic organizer, might just be the right combination for students to use when they are approaching a problem-solving task. The action assessment plan. So my plan includes applying the problem-solving poem, and this is primarily to provide a sense of novelty within a classroom of artists and performers. I have lots of musicians and kids that participate in theater, and so this just added an element of excitement to our classroom. So the expectation is that students will recite the poem and follow each step of the verse. I am using the district-adopted McGraw-Hill curriculum, and I'm applying an explicit instruction approach that follows a sequence of modeling, guided practice, and independent practice. The assessments that I will apply are a culminating problem, which I will call a ticket out the door for the students, kind of to ease off the wording of a high-stakes assessment. And I will take tally marks of the total number of students whose work indicates that they followed the steps of the poem. And I want to know if students are indicating that they're reciting the poem each time. So the best way that I think I can do that is to take a look at their work and see if they are using the corresponding symbols, lines, circles on their work. Also looking at the work samples for each corresponding lesson, and finally providing a student survey in which I can find out if students are finding that the poem is helpful or beneficial to their learning process. Implementation. Over a period of 3 weeks, using the district-adopted curriculum, I taught them this strategy. For week 1, I introduced the poem within a familiar problem-solving tasks, problems that I had already taught. There were several lessons leading up to these 2 that I selected, and so the students were familiar with the scenarios of problem-solving and those types of situations. For week 1, we just reviewed it, talked about it. We went over the song, the poem. Some chose to use a spoken word approach, and others sang the song. During week 2, I provided explicit instruction around finding extra or missing information. For week 3, I provided explicit instruction around interpret the remainder. And again, I followed the instructional cycle of explicit instruction, guided practice, independent practice. We did some homework corrections for each lesson, and then had a culminating problem. This is the data results for the lesson on find extra or missing information. 89.7% was the average score on the culminating problem. It appeared that the students were successfully applying each verse of the poem and getting the correct answers at the end. As I looked over their work, the students' work indicated that 97% of students were following the steps, and they were able to correctly identify the operation that they used and even provide an additional statement about how they knew that there was extra or missing information. This is a student sample. You can see that this student went through each step, underlining, circle, crossing off information. They clearly identified the operation that they chose to apply, and then wrote a concluding statement. This student also went through all the steps. A very simple sentence. I would have liked to have got a little bit more as to how he or she arrived at their answer. And then finally, this student went through all the steps and wrote out everything that they did, and also with the concluding sentence. This is the data for interpret the remainder. 79.4% was the average score on the ticket out the door, and 94% of my students followed the steps. Those with the incorrect answers had difficulty in relating the remainder to the original question. So they interpreted the quotient as just a number, and so the remainder didn't mean anything to them. It was just a number that was left over. They did not go back into the problem itself to identify what they were being asked to find. And these are some student samples. You can see that one of the expectations is that there is a clear statement concluding how they got their answer. This is the data results for 2 questions that I posed my students. Does the poem help you when you solve word problems? And 85% said that it did, and 14% said no, it does not help them. The other question was, how often do you use the poem to help you remember the steps to solve the word problem? And indicated in blue, 26.5% said always, every single time. 55% said sometimes, and 11% said rarely, every once in a while, and the remaining percentage said never. I asked a follow-up question of, can you give some examples of how the problem-solving poem helps you? And if you prefer not to use a problem-solving poem, tell me why. 4 themes emerged from the answers that my students gave me. The first one is they found that it was useful for sequencing the steps. I had one student say that the problem-solving poem helped him or her by organizing the problem so that she, quote, doesn't mix up the problem. Another theme was that it was useful for understanding. Some students said that it helped them to understand what the question was telling them to do to answer the problem, and it helped them find key points in the problem that they were solving. Another theme was that it was useful for remembering. So students indicated that the rhyme or the song aspect helped them to remember how to approach the problem-solving task. One student said that when I forget to underline or cross out, I sing the song and remember that I have to do that, and it helps me go faster through the problem. Finally, there were a couple of students who indicated that the word problem-solving song was not helpful to them, and they stated that it was mostly because they were a little distracted by it. They didn't know whether they were supposed to follow all the steps, or they indicated that they were confused at times, that they might even cross off important information, and that they didn't like using it because it took too much time. Findings. Students are in fact applying the problem-solving poem to their work. They're scoring in the upper range of 70 and 80%. I find that I think they need further help in identifying the language or patterns within the problem. So I'm hoping to employ a problem-solving graphic organizer to help them track their steps and even identify the types of problems that they're given. I think that if I take the problem-solving poem and add a graphic organizer to it, it will further scaffold my students so that they can successfully problem solve. Some limitations to my research were scheduling conflicts. There were times where I had to begin math in the morning and finish it in the afternoon. We had a arts integration program running at the exact same time, so I had to be very flexible in terms of when I could teach and when I had to go into the program. Another limitation was the McGraw-Hill content. It provided great practice problems, however, because it doesn't build schema and it certainly does not have a graphic concept support built in, I found that conducting this intervention was very helpful. Some absences limited the results as well. I have, like I said, a few students with IEPs and a few kids that go to speech as well. So these pull-out programs unfortunately took them from my classroom when I needed them. Reflection. I see problem-solving tasks as a culmination of mathematical skills in real-life scenarios. So reading, writing, math, thinking skills, they all come together. And I think by the end of this research, my students were starting to see how important it was to read carefully and to track their steps and apply all their skills in order to solve word problems. This process allowed me to have a better understanding of who my students are and what their needs are. I have certain students who prefer to use manipulatives, some students who wanted to stand up and work out the problem with other students and kind of move things around and move their bodies around so that they could get a really good idea of what the problem was asking. And finally, I think the fact that I had a very clear goal and a direction in which I was heading allowed the data to help guide my instruction. If I were to go into a phase 2 of this, I would use this graphic organizer and basically follow a very similar action and assessment plan as the one that I just completed. I'm hoping that this will help my students track their learning, their thinking, and be able to organize their thoughts a little bit better. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation.